of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
With the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, it's a regional organization of several LGBT activists working in at least 8 countries in Southeast Asia. We have been lobbying and influencing ASEAN governments to make them responsive to LGBT rights.
The main reason is to really ensure that SOGIE will not be left behind in any ASEAN human rights mechanism.
The LGBT community has been very active for the past decades. The movement is increasingly becoming stronger. There have been participation in formal politics.
We have around more than 120 LGBT organizations within Indonesia. But in the other side, also the fundamentalist movement also is growing up.
It's an uphill climb because there are countries in Southeast Asia that have very restrictive laws.
So in terms of the state, we see some laws in place or policies in place that violate fundamental rights of LGBT persons. And then there are also stigma and discrimination that people face from society.
In terms of safety and security, we are in a better place. But that doesn't mean that violence doesn't happen, that there are no hate crimes. I mean, there are a lot of hate crimes that happen, especially to those who are visible, especially trans women.
We are still much discriminated and stigmatized, especially for LGBTI people in rural areas.
We cannot get a job when we apply the CV, and then they call for interview, and then they see who you are and they throw out your application.
We see that the scope of law still not yet include the LGBT or protect the LGBT.
The ASEAN as a regional mechanism is new and it's still evolving. But I think in terms of SOGIE issues, it's important to understand that the international norms and standards are already set. And so at least follow those norms.
This is our right. As LGBT we have right. And that's the state responsibility to fulfill our right.
Structurally, consensus is a key principle, and if some countries that are homophobic do not accept our positions, then we know that we are in a deadlock.
Reality-wise, ASEAN SOGIE Caucus is preventing things from getting worse.
The power of coming together within the ASEAN is really, I think is more in the hands of the civil society, the people's ASEAN.
And if we can come together and start talking about gender and SOGIE, then we can start talking what is the root causes of many problems in our society.
It was very empowering to be able to walk on the streets with rainbow flags with people, right? So I think that's some sort of change. But in terms of structural change, maybe maybe not yet.
The time has come. We only waiting when the door is open. It's only the time. It will be there sooner or later.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Grace.
And of course, you are at our Monday Morning Matters. Today, what issue that we are talking about is an issue that is I would say taboo in Southeast Asia.
For sure, yes.
But in other regions in the world, it has been a cause for celebration and a victory, in fact. I'm talking about the issue regarding on same-sex marriage.
Right.
Of course, the US recently, US Supreme Court recently have made a historic mark on the same-sex marriage, where they allowed the LGBT community to also get license for marriage.
Yep.
But when it comes to that kind of conversation in our Southeast Asian context, it's very much lacking, right?
And it is still a very sensitive sort of topic in Southeast Asia. Like you mentioned before, a lot of people still think that it's such a taboo. And then even with the modern society, people look like we have an open mind, and then maybe perhaps people accept this kind of issue better than before. But still, in general, there are lots of sort of behind stories and rumors when it comes to LGBT.
So it's not just the state, even among communities and society, the issue of LGBT is not something that people can freely talk about. But here at Duran ASEAN, we actually invite an LGBT activist. He's part of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. His name is Ryan Silverio. He will be sharing with us more on the reality in Southeast Asia, as well as on the recent news on same-sex marriage. So hi Ryan.
Hello Arlene.
So how are you, by the way?
I'm doing good. Things are well.
So thanks for accepting our interview, and perhaps you can share a bit of yourself and your background.
Sure. My name is Ryan, and I'm the regional coordinator of ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. SOGIE stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Gender Expression. We are based in the Philippines. Our secretariat is here in Manila, but we do have several members across different countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia.
When was ASEAN SOGIE started?
It started way back in 2011, at the time when different civil society organizations have been opening doors within ASEAN through the ASEAN Civil Society Conference. We continued to bring in LGBT activists from different countries to engage in civil society meetings. And that's basically what we have done in the past.
So you yourself, what is the experience living in Southeast Asia, or in the Philippines in this case, being an LGBT person?
You know what, Philippines, interestingly, in social media and online news, has been identified as one of the gay, quote-unquote, gay or LGBT-friendly countries around the world.
Oh.
And somehow we can say so. There's a high level of tolerance amongst LGBTIQ persons here in the country. We can do pride marches without negative backlashes coming from the police or the government. In fact, governments have also, or local governments have also supported LGBT pride marches here in the country. And academic institutions, at least at the higher education level, have somehow opened up spaces like LGBT studies have been introduced in gender and development courses and human rights courses. And then also we have an LGBT political party here, which has in the elections in recent years. And there are a lot of LGBT groups around. Does that mean that it's a friendly country still? We do not have anti-discrimination laws, and same-sex marriage is not yet deemed as legal here in the country, and there have been some cases of hate crimes as well.
What about religious institution? Is the voices on LGBT unanimously against them, or mixed?
The big religious institutions, including the Roman Catholic Church, has been very vocal. One, they are against same-sex marriage. They are against same-sex consensual practices. Again, looking at sex and sexuality as something that's exclusive for heterosexual couples. And of course, it is something that is closely linked to procreation, something that is exclusive to the institution of marriage. The same thing with the other religious groups. However, there are some individual priests or nuns who have been supportive of our cause.
But then after the U.S. legalized LGBT and same-sex marriage in that country, there were news that released from the Philippines, especially that certain communities are very strongly against this, the legalization of the same-sex marriage. And what is your perspectives towards this?
Well, for one, because there's a law that defines marriage as something that's exclusive to between a man and a woman. The Family Code of the Philippines explicitly says so. However, there are some legal initiatives to question whether our existing constitution also defines marriage as something that's between a man and a woman.
Right.
Because I think our current constitution looks at marriage as something that can be entered into between two persons. Meanwhile, the Family Code, a national law, explicitly specifies it as something that's between a man and a woman.
So for you yourself, personally, do you think same-sex marriage can be legalized in Southeast Asia?
Philippines, it would entail a long haul struggle because for now, the
religion will be one of the main, I would say, stumble block, I guess.
Absolutely, and it's going to be an uphill struggle for all of us. We have to understand that religious groups also have strong political influence as well. Meanwhile, there are also important issues that we need to address, including violence and a host of multiple forms of discrimination that we do face.
And when it comes to the LGBT community in Southeast Asia, perhaps you can break it down on what are the misconceptions that people usually have on this community and what actually the reality they are facing that a lot of people might not realize it.
Number one, LGBT activism equates to pursuing same-sex marriage. While marriage equality is a human right that we do have to advocate for, we are also fighting for other struggles, violence and discrimination. Violence, for example, within the family, there have been some recorded cases of abuse, of direct assaults, or forced conversions being perpetrated by family members. Within the schools, there are cases of bullying and even denial of access to schools. Employment, you have LGBT people who are not allowed to get employed or denied of livelihood because of their identities.
And we will take one short break. When we return, we will discuss more with Ryan Silverio on the issue regarding on same-sex marriage as well as the plights of LGBT in Southeast Asia.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene.
Welcome back. This is Grace.
And of course, you're still with us and Ryan regarding on the topic of same-sex marriage as well as LGBT communities in Southeast Asia. So, earlier on, we talked about the misconception that people have on the LGBT communities. But what are the social stigma surrounding these communities?
Okay, social stigma number one, we are immoral. Funny as it seems, but the language of morality has been used against us. For example, when an LGBT political party tried to run for the elections way back in 2010, the Commission on Elections of the Philippines have even quoted provisions in the Bible, in the Quran, and used against us. Of course, that was challenged to in the Supreme Court, and we invoked the separation of church and state principles just in our favor. Immorality is also used against us when we go to schools. You have to change the language, that you have to change. As if being gay or being lesbian is wrong.
I see. So in this case, when it comes to LGBT in Southeast Asia, they definitely face greater challenges compared to LGBT in the Western world. Another area that I would like to highlight is criminalization of homosexuality, and of course you see that in Malaysia especially. How can we change that, and why this is happening in the first place?
Challenging laws is very important, but it's also difficult. Number one, we need to beef up our political influence as LGBT activists, as LGBT movement. I think we need to forge alliances with other human rights and civil society organizations to support our cause. Now, why is there criminalization of homosexuality? I think it depends on the history, the political history of per country. Like, for example, Malaysia and Singapore, the anti-sodomy laws have been inherited from colonial predecessors. At the same time, criminalization of homosexuality is also linked into creating an ideal society that is different from the colonial predecessors. There's also influence of religious institutions, such as in the case of Brunei, such as in the case of in Indonesia, where Sharia laws have also been enforced somehow.
So when it comes to LGBT and furthermore same-sex marriage, and now more people are aware of this legalization of a same-sex marriage, but then how has this news affect Southeast Asia?
It has pros and cons. Pros because when the decision took place, it somehow re-energized the movement.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interestingly, in the Philippines, the decision took place the day before the Pride March. So that has made that has caused a lot of excitement amongst LGBT activists here. It also somehow raised visibility in terms of media.
Right.
Like a lot of news and TV coverage about it took place and put again into the spotlight LGBT issues. But it also had negative backlash.
Of course. And then
negative backlash. Number one, it will. There are discourses saying that this will lead to Western imperialism, as articulated by opposition groups. When also at the same time, it has caused negative implications on our movement, because somehow that oppositions have been somehow quiet on our issues, which is good because it will somehow allow our activism to go on more smoothly. But this time, opposition groups are becoming more vigilant because they have equated somehow our issues of general LGBT human rights to same-sex marriage solely.
The discourse on LGBT on the level that is, I would say, wide. There is on the societal level in general is quite lacking. Usually, when we talk about the plights of LGBT, the conversation has been quite niche to either towards among the LGBT community or among those who are sympathizers of the LGBT community, which are not really that widespread, especially in countries that are religious. And we all know Southeast Asia is one of the most religious region in the world. How can we create LGBT discourse as a positive discourse on the societal level?
You know what, Arlene? We are promoting the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a concept that was framed by feminist activists many years ago. It recognizes that an individual person is not only defined by his or her gender, but by a multitude of identities brought about by race, by class, by social contexts, by physical ability, so on and so forth. Now, as an LGBT person, I am not gay. I am not just a lesbian alone. I'm not just a transgender alone. I can be a migrant worker. I can be a member of an indigenous community. I am also a worker. I can be a youth. I can be a student. I can be a person from urban poor areas.
For sure.
And the list go on and on and on. And because of these identities, there are also corresponding issues as well. For example, how my sexuality and gender identity can aggravate my situation of being poor. Or how perhaps my gender identity can intersect with my migration status. Because of this, our issues become more complex. Yeah? And we need to build alliances with other NGOs who are also covering the similar issues that we do face. For example, I'm a gay student that was denied access to school or being bullied in school. My alliance will not just be limited to LGBT activists alone, but also to youth and students movement. I'm a transgender person and I am dismissed from work. Now my allies would not just be then LGBT activists, but also trade unions and workers groups. Yeah? Again, bringing to the realization that our issues are not just limited to gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression, but also the other issues that are based on our lived experiences.
I wanted to ask you about, so you are saying that by legalizing or even extending the acceptance of LGBT or same-sex marriage will give more rights or also the freedom to those community.
Absolutely. If we eradicate discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, that will put us, LGBTIQ persons, one step forward towards equality.
Then how about the concerns, perhaps the potential concerns that will happen after it is accepted in Southeast Asia?
What do you mean potential concerns?
Like for example, okay, let's say the LGBT and all the same-sex marriage is allowed in certain countries in Southeast Asia, but wouldn't the other countries who are really strong against it, wouldn't that have any conflict within Southeast Asia?
I think it really depends on the issue. Vietnam, for example, the Ministry of Justice of Vietnam, for example, has removed prohibitions against same-sex marriage, but of course they haven't legalized it yet. That's a good move.
Right.
In fact, it can somehow reinforce notions that, hey, why in one country is it okay? Then perhaps it can also be okay in another, considering the somehow close proximity of our cultures and political contexts.
We'll take another short break. When we return, we will discuss more on this particular issue with Ryan Silverio.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Grace.
And of course, you are still with us on our Monday Morning Matters regarding on the same-sex marriage in the US as well as how it impacts the LGBT community in Southeast Asia. So for ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, after the verdict by the US Supreme Court to legalize same-sex marriage, how does it impact your organization and how does it impact LGBT activists in this region?
As I've said earlier, one, it serves as a positive factor because it raises the visibility of the issue, but it also brings some untoward consequences. Second, while it helps towards strengthening discourses towards marriage equality, it may also somehow overshadow the different issues that are more close to our lived realities, discrimination and violence in our different contexts.
I mean, how does it impact ASEAN SOGIE Caucus? Are you guys perhaps would you guys try to focus on maybe certain areas where it's doable and is you are able to push the conversation even further within society?
Well, Arlene, it's because within ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, we recognize that marriage equality is important, but there are also other issues that are more important that need to be addressed. We haven't gone further in terms of bringing discourse to a higher level when it comes to marriage equality. At this point, what we are more highlighting of are issues of violence and discrimination on the basis of SOGIE.
So violence and discrimination, especially discriminative laws against against the LGBT community, is one of the key focus of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus in Southeast Asia?
Absolutely.
So how has the case been brought out on the highest level, which is the ASEAN Summit?
Number one, we have continued to challenge the decisions of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. When they come up with the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, they're very clear. Domestic, political, and cultural contexts prevail and still have to be used when we interpret international human rights instruments. Now, what is its implication on our issue? Countries continue to criminalize LGBTIQ persons in their local laws, in their local practices. Local contexts, local discourse look at LGBTIQ persons as immoral and abnormal people, and this will then have to be used in terms of using international instruments. Like number one, will for example, will Malaysia or will Brunei Darussalam recognize non-discrimination principle against SOGIE? I think it's going to be difficult, even if we're saying that, non-discrimination is part of international instruments, because for them what is more important will be the domestic laws.
Right.
Right? Now, it's really a chicken and egg problem, but we have to start somewhere. For us, it has to be both. Number one, we need to reinforce the strength of international instruments. At the same time, we also need to work on grassroots movement, building alliance with local groups inside, or friendly individuals within the government to continue to challenge discriminatory laws.
All right.
Malaysia has good examples, like Justice for Sisters, when they challenged the decision of the local courts that criminalize cross-dressing, which is against transgender persons. It's a good way to start.
That's true. It's a good way to start. And another good way to start is to look at the younger generation nowadays. Young Southeast Asia having a changing attitude toward LGBT communities.
I agree with you. When we had a conversation in KL together with different LGBT activists around the region, there's a realization that our movement is young. Literally, we're young because the LGBT movement here in Southeast Asia has been here for like 2 decades compared to the other social movements that have been there since the 70s or 60s. At the same time, the demographic profile of activists are also young.
So it's a good sign, right?
It's a good sign, absolutely. And they have in fact, they're now more. Rather, the supporters are the digital natives who are using social media, online platforms to support their cause. And they're more open-minded when it comes to sensitive issues like LGBT.
Right.
And if you attend pride marches and gatherings, you will see their young people around.
So, another question leading to the younger generation, do you think maybe in the next 2 decades we will see some changes, not just in terms of societal's attitude, but also in terms of ASEAN as a region accepting LGBT
Well, I think there will be changes. We have to be very optimistic about it. I mean, look at the UN. It took a number of years before finally the Human Rights Council come up with a resolution on sexual orientation and gender identity. Who knows? The ASEAN Human Rights Commissions will somehow have initiatives on SOGIE.
And you also mentioned earlier about intersectionality, because I think that is really important, especially you want to talk about a community that is being discriminated, and they are further being discriminated based on other identities that they carry on. So when it comes to ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, is part of your future direction is to focus on trying to understand the complexity of LGBT communities in Southeast Asia?
Yes, in fact, it is one of the strategic directions of the caucus to look into the multiple forms and complex experiences of discrimination. We have already started discussions with other sectoral groups. In at least 3 countries, we have organized workshops on intersectionality, where we discuss LGBT issues together with non-LGBTIQ activists, and we have gained so much support on that regard.
So, in the coming future, what is your plan? I mean, your plan, I guess, ASEAN SOGIE's plan. What area that you wish to push forward? What kind of conversation that you wish to address better, besides the issue on violence and discrimination?
Number one, we have to strengthen our ranks. As I said earlier, changes within the political system, you have to have strong influence. You have to have strong numbers. Yeah? And we have to bank on the wide support coming from the young generation. We have to have more LGBTIQ activists. Interestingly, we have leaders in different countries. We have spokespersons of different groups. So we want more people to speak up. Young LGBTIQ persons as well as youth leaders to also talk about the need to recognize the human rights of LGBTIQ persons. That's number one. We have to strengthen our numbers. We have to strengthen our ranks to have more political influence. Number two, we also need to create alliances with information multipliers. Media is good because at least independent media has given us some positive messages to support our cause. Education institutions are also good allies. Countries like in the Philippines, as well as in Thailand, it's the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity is already being discussed in schools.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Like for example, some universities in Thailand have already come up with anti-bullying laws or policies, which somehow gives a level of protection on the part of students. Gender studies courses that have proliferated across the region. These are good spaces to talk about LGBTIQ issues. Also, human rights courses are also good entry points. Like there's an interesting group called SIHRN, Southeast Asia Human Rights Studies Network, which recently had a conference in Kuala Lumpur last year. I think you were there, Arlene.
Yes, I was there.
I think that was the first time I've met you. Yeah, it's these public spaces that talk about human rights are also spaces where we can level up the discourse on LGBTIQ issues.
That's true. I totally agree with that. But what about other countries that we seldom hear? I mean, their domestic issue regarding on LGBT, like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. Are they also catching up?
Myanmar is interesting because at least in the past 3 years, democratic institutions and processes are gradually opening up and strengthening, and LGBT groups have been in the forefront. There's a group called Colors Rainbow, which is a member of ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, and they've been doing human rights education at the grassroots level. They have organized public events such as film screenings, as well as public talks on LGBTIQ issues.
I see. And what about Laos and Cambodia? Especially Laos is...
We do not have members in Lao, unfortunately, so I can't speak so much about the extent of it, but we are trying to build contacts with some individual activists there. Cambodia is, at least in the past 3 years, hasn't been much on the radar when it comes to LGBTIQ activism. But there's one interesting group called ASEAN, which is a member of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. They have had dialogues with the Ministry of Education, with the Ministry of Information. They have engaged with big international groups like United Nations, UNDP, UN Women, etc. Again, bringing SOGIE and integrating SOGIE into the other areas of their programs.
And that
is also an interesting group because it's a youth-led, youth-driven organization.
And actually, majority of the LGBT groups in Southeast Asia are led by the younger generation.
Yep, that's true.
Even in Singapore, where I think last year they had a massive blow by the Wear White movement when they had the Pink Dot event for the LGBT community in Singapore. How does it affect the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus?
The young generation, we need to understand, one, what are their issues? Issues when it comes to school discrimination, issues in terms of family violence and employment violence. These issues have to be recognized and should be articulated in our advocacy causes. Number two, what are their forms of activism? Online activism, online engagement. You know, I grew up in a generation when you say you're an activist, you have to go out to the streets and protest, carrying placards. But that was like so passé. When nowadays, young generation of activists would employ Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms, change.org, online petitions here and there. So we also have to change our advocacy tactics as well when we engage with young people.
That's definitely correct. And unfortunately, we are at the end of our show today, but it's really I would say refreshing to hear voices from Southeast Asia talking about issue as sensitive as LGBT and same-sex marriage and the plights that they face as a community. So thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. Thank you, Grace.
You're welcome.